When Captain James Cook's ship, the Endeavour, anchored off the shores of Australia in 1770, history books told us it was the beginning of discovery. But the truth is far more unsettling. What we were taught as exploration was, in reality, the beginning of an invasion. Long before Cook arrived, Australia was not an untouched wilderness. It was a thriving land, home to over 500 different Aboriginal nations, each with their own languages, customs, and spiritual connections to country. For more than 65,000 years, the Aboriginal peoples had built one of the world's most enduring cultures. They were astronomers who mapped the stars with precision, farmers who cultivated yam fields and managed fisheries, and artists who painted on rock walls stories that stretched across millennia. Their dream time was not myth. It was a living archive of history, science, and spirituality. But when Cook stepped ashore, all of this was ignored. He raised the Union Jack and declared the land terra nullius, nobody's land. This single declaration denied the existence of entire civilizations. In the stroke of a pen, tens of thousands of years of culture were dismissed as if they had never existed. Early colonial writings painted Aboriginal peoples as primitive and savage, a dangerous myth that justified British claims. Instead of recognizing them as custodians of the land, they were written out of the story, reduced to footnotes in their own homeland. Children in schools were later taught that Australia began in 1770 with Cook's discovery. But what was silenced was the truth, that this so-called discovery was the start of a systematic erasure of people, culture, and identity. And this was just the surface, because what followed wasn't just rewriting history, it was bloodshed. As British settlers expanded inland, resistance from Aboriginal nations grew. The encounters were not peaceful, they were violent. Entire communities were pushed off their land, sacred sites were destroyed, and voices that had spoken for tens of thousands of years were silenced. Australia is often celebrated as the land of opportunity, a place of freedom under the sun. But its foundations were not built on freedom, they were built on chains. In 1788, just 18 years after Captain Cook's fateful landing, the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay. On board were not pioneers or adventurers, but over 700 convicts, men and women dragged across the oceans from Britain's overflowing prisons. Australia was never meant to be a paradise. It was Britain's solution to a problem, a dumping ground for those society had cast out. The conditions they endured were brutal. Shackled below deck for months, disease spread like wildfire. Many didn't survive the journey. Those who did were met not with fresh beginnings, but with backbreaking labor under the scorching Australian sun. They were forced to clear forests, build roads, and lay the foundations of settlements under the watchful eyes of soldiers armed with muskets and whips. Punishments for disobedience were cruel. A stolen loaf of bread, a failed attempt to escape, even the smallest act of defiance could lead to public floggings, iron chains, or worse, execution. Convict women were not spared. Many were subjected to abuse and exploitation, their lives controlled by a system that viewed them as less than human. But the suffering wasn't only physical. Convicts were stripped of their identities, branded with shame and told they would never belong. Australia for them was not a new life, it was a life sentence in exile. And yet from this misery came a legacy that would shape the nation. Convicts built the very foundations of Australia's first towns, Sydney, Parramatta, Hobart, brick by brick, often with blood in the mortar. The architecture of early Australia was raised on the sweat of prisoners. Over time, many convicts were freed, becoming farmers, tradesmen, even business owners. But the shadow of this convict past lingered. It created a deep class divide between the free settlers who came by choice and the convicts who came in chains. That divide fed resentment, rebellion, and even early uprisings, like the Rum Rebellion of 1808, the only successful armed takeover of government in Australian history. And yet, this convict stain was never fully erased. For generations, Australians buried their convict ancestry, ashamed of its stigma. Only recently has the nation begun to reclaim this past, not as a mark of shame, but as part of its identity. While convicts suffered under chains, an even darker story was unfolding across the vast Australian continent, a story of people who had lived here for tens of thousands of years, and whose voices were being silenced. From the moment the first fleet arrived in 1788, conflict with Aboriginal peoples was inevitable. The British declared the land their own, ignoring the deep spiritual connection indigenous nations had to country. Farms expanded, forests were cleared, and rivers were taken. What followed became known as the Frontier Wars, a series of violent clashes between settlers and Aboriginal resistance fighters. These weren't small skirmishes. They were organized campaigns, often brutal, often one-sided. Settlers, supported by colonial troops, carried out massacres that left entire communities destroyed. The numbers were hidden in official records, but historians now estimate that tens of thousands of Aboriginal men, women, and children were killed across more than a century of frontier violence. Yet for generations, these wars were denied. School books called settlement peaceful. History lessons skipped over the bloodshed. The silence wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. But violence was only part of the tragedy. Policies of assimilation struck at the heart of Aboriginal families. From the late 19th century into the 20th, thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their homes in what is now remembered as the stolen generations. Authorities claimed it was for protection, but in truth it was a systematic attempt to erase culture, language, and identity. Children were placed in missions, orphanages, or foster homes, forbidden from speaking their languages or practicing their traditions. Many never saw their families again. Mothers searched for lost children. Generations carried wounds that words cannot fully describe. For decades, these stories remained hidden. Governments denied them, textbooks ignored them, and public memory looked away. But the voices of survivors refused to be silenced. Their testimonies, raw, painful, and unflinching, finally began to break through the walls of denial in the late 20th century. Still, even today, the scars remain. Sacred sites have been destroyed. Languages have been lost. Families remain separated by the policies of the past. And many Australians are only just beginning to reckon with the full truth of what was done. Today, Australia stands as a proud and modern nation. But beneath the skylines of Sydney and Melbourne, beneath the image of beaches, wildlife, and freedom, lies a history still waiting to be reckoned with. For generations, the darker chapters of Australia's past were buried. Convicts reduced to whispers. Aboriginal resistance erased, massacres hidden, and stolen children forgotten. But truth has a way of resurfacing, and in recent decades, a powerful movement has forced the nation to confront its past. In 1992, the Mabo decision overturned the lie of terra nullius, legally recognizing that Aboriginal peoples had lived here long before colonization. In 2008, the Prime Minister delivered a national apology to the stolen generations, acknowledging decades of suffering caused by government policies. Across the country, voices are rising. Indigenous leaders, artists, and communities are reclaiming their languages, their land rights, and their place in Australia's story. History books are being rewritten, and school children are finally learning the truths once kept from their parents and grandparents. Yet, reconciliation is not simple. Debates continue over constitutional recognition, over sovereignty, over how much of the past can ever be healed. Some call for treaties, others for deeper reforms. The path forward is complex and the wounds of history run deep. But what is undeniable is this: the oldest living culture on Earth is still here. Against all odds, Aboriginal peoples survived invasion, massacres, and forced removal. Their resilience, knowledge, and voices continue to shape Australia's identity. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more hidden histories and untold stories from around the world.